Good morning, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about IBron and Bron Mass, relevant cross protection for our times. The infectious bronchitis as a disease is an acute, highly contagious viral disease of chickens. It infects chickens of every age. It's distributed worldwide, and depending on the virus strains, we could observe respiratory signs, namely respiratory noise or air sac at the plant. We could have kidney disease where we see flushing, and actually this is one of the ways the virus could cause mortality. And we could have reproductive signs, so where we have basically the virus infecting layers or broiler breeders and leading to decreased egg production and in the worst case, false layers. And we're going to talk about false layers later on. Not all infectious bronchitis viruses are equal. The Massachusetts strain, the first virus that was isolated and characterized back in the 1930s, basically had a predilection for the respiratory, reproductive, and urinary tract. So it gave us a view of the full potential of infectious bronchitis infections and how it could affect the birds. The second strain identified, the Connecticut strain, was primarily a respiratory virus. The Arkansas virus has a predilection for the respiratory and reproductive tracts. The Georgia 07 virus, for example, is a nephropathogenic virus. It has a predilection for the kidneys. Georgia 08 and Georgia 13, more relevant nowadays, are primarily respiratory viruses. And then we had the DMV1639, a virus we're going to spend time talking about today. Just like the mass of old, this virus can infect the respiratory, reproductive, and urinary tract with severe consequences. There's another group of viruses that is on our radar right now. These are basically the PA1220-98 like viruses. They have piqued our interest because we have seen them infecting broiler breeders and layers with effects on egg production and the eggs themselves. So basically, from what we know so far, it looks like these viruses have a predilection for the reproductive tract. The infectious bronchitis virus belongs to the gamma coronavirus group. These are avian origin viruses which do not infect or cause disease in humans. In contrast to that, the COVID-19 virus is a beta coronavirus, along with its predecessors, the SARS and MERS viruses. Infectious bronchitis has a single-stranded RNA genome, and what this really means is the RNA molecule is more prone to spontaneous mutations and recombination, which leads to the emergence of variants and new strains. As we know from MERS, the first virus we ever discovered, as years go by, we have discovered more and new strains and variants. Of particular interest in the virus structure is the spike protein. John Elatrash alluded to this. This is a club-shaped protein that is used by the virus for host cell attachment. It's a critical point in infection. And the other thing that makes this spike protein important is that when infection happens, this generates strain-specific neutralizing antibody that are important for protection against infectious bronchitis. So now let's talk about the infectious bronchitis challenge in the U.S. from 2014 on, with an emphasis on relevant variants or strains. So in 2014-2015, the most relevant viruses were the Georgia 08 virus, which was basically in the southeastern part of the United States. We had Georgia 13 in northeast Georgia, and then we had the DMV1639 virus in the Delmarva Peninsula. So the Delmarva Peninsula at the time was experiencing broiler mortality rates as high as 30% from kidney failure associated with the DMV1639 infection. As this is happening, we had another situation going, and this is what we call the Ark rolling reactions. In flocks vaccinated with the Ark vaccine, basically the virus will not take very well after hatchery vaccination, and then the Ark vaccine will emerge at random times during the grow-out cycle in the birds, leading to clinical consequences. We call that a rolling respiratory reaction. As we look at 2015 onwards to date, we still have the Georgia 08 in the southeast United States. We still have Georgia 13 in northeast Georgia. But since then, we also found Georgia 08 and 13 in the state of North Carolina. Now, of most significant to all of us is the fact that from 2015 on, the DMV1639 virus has spread to the majority of the poultry production areas, the largest poultry production areas in our country, and it has had severe consequences. So let's talk about this, the DMV virus. This is a virus unlike we have ever seen in the United States, particularly because of its clinical consequences. As I stated, when the worst winter on the shore was basically in 2014, 2015, and what you will see is basically severe flushing. The litter will get slick, wet. The birds will be wet and cold, could not keep their feathers clean. They will huddle. And as I mentioned, mortality rates as high as 30%. And these birds were dying primarily from severe dehydration. They could not retain water because their kidneys were not working, concentrating the urine. So basically they will drink and the water will come right out. So they will die of dehydration. Why? Because the virus was targeting the kidneys. So in this picture that I'm pointing at, basically you have swollen kidneys where the kidneys, where they normally sit flat against the back of the bird, now these lobes of the kidney are bulging out at us. And then we had the end-stage kidney. This is basically when they go into full kidney failure, and you will see these pale kidneys with a prominent tubular pattern. Now, all along, the virus was basically infecting the respiratory tract, and you will have increased condoms at the plant. But basically, from 2015 on, the virus became predominantly respiratory. And what you will see, as we have here in the bottom left, it's basically suds in the air sac. And these suds in the air sac, this is basically a silent air saculitis. When you walk in the house, there's no respiratory, there's no overt noise, there's nothing that tells you they have respiratory, but it's not until you do a necropsy, and then you will see these suds in the air sac, usually between 28 and 32 days of age. This air saculitis could and at times would progress to basically acacious air saculitis, the proverbial cheese in the air sacs. And of course, this causes increased air sac condemnation. So, and this is one of the biggest economic impacts of the infectious, of the DMV 1639, other than affecting things like average daily gain and also feed conversion. Now, as I mentioned before, this virus likes the reproductive, urinary and reproductive tracts. And of course, we didn't see the impact in the reproductive tract, particularly in the Marlborough where the virus started, because there's no layers over there and very few breeders. But it's not until the virus gets basically move on to Pennsylvania, Canada, and then other parts of the United States that we saw the reproductive effects, decreased egg production, and in the worst case, what we call the false layers. And basically, this is an infection inside the first 20 days of age of the pullet. The virus destroys the oviduct, and all you have is the remnants of the oviduct, the outer membrane. And this outer membrane sometimes will fill with fluid as the hens age, and you will basically have a cystic left oviduct. The ovary is intact, sexual maturity ensues, they go into production, but there's no oviduct to produce the eggs, so these hens will not lay a single egg. And so for you to get a feel of the impact of this flux with false layers basically average about a 70% peak, whereas the expectation is in over 90%. And again, these hens will never lay a single egg. So in lieu of all this, let's talk about IBron and Bron Mass Divas infectious bronchitis vaccines. IBron is the only licensed monovalent Georgia 08 type vaccine with label claims against Georgia 08, 13, and DMV 1639. We launched this vaccine in 2015, and the first serials went to the Delmarva Peninsula to combat the DMV 1639. In 2017, we determined that IBron combined with a mass vaccine provides cross protection against Ark. So we did post-licensing control experiment and field trials, and we presented these results at the 2018 AVMA AAAP meeting. Now, most of our broilers customers on Mass and IBron had dropped the Ark from their vaccination program and keep avoiding these Ark vaccine rolling reactions. In 2020, we launched the Bron Mass vaccine. This is a classic mass vaccine and the perfect companion for IBron to provide effective, relevant, and broad protection against Georgia 08, Georgia 13, DMV1639, and Ark. And to give you a feel for the impact of this is we currently have about 34% of the U.S. broiler population on a Mass Plus IBron program. And most of these customers have stopped using the Ark vaccine and avoid the rolling reactions. Since launch, basically IBron and Bron Mass have been supported by a value-added precedent-setting technical and scientific services. And we have established evaluation of hatchery vaccination procedures. This is vaccine handling, delivery, process audits, and equipment checks and adjustments. And this is all under the umbrella of our chick program. We also started innovative and forward-looking use of the quantitative RT-PCR technique for infectious bronchitis detection. And we have used this tool to its fullest for vaccine detection, where we look at the vaccines 5 days post-hatchery vaccination. We use this tool for diagnostics, and we also use this tool for virus surveillance. This is an example of what we have done and accomplished with vaccine detection. We basically, in the past, we were just spraying the birds. And basically, if we added dye, we were able to see the spray pattern on the chicks in the chick box, and also we could do some tongue staining checks. But now we basically have moved on to doing choanal swabs in individual chicks. So we look at 15 chicks in a flock, we test them individually, and what we're aiming for is that 75% or more of those chicks had the vaccines that were applied in the hatchery. And our first reports basically look like this, what I'm pointing at here on the right. And basically we're reporting positive, which is less than 36, between CT 36 and 40, that's a suspect, and a CT value of 40 is negative. But then our colleague Matilde Alfonso started looking recently in 2020 at the individual CT values and try to look if some patterns will emerge from that, and indeed they do. If you look at the individual CT values and you graph them in linear fashion from low to high, you will see the distribution of the CT values. And basically what you want to see is most of those samples, whether positive, but you want them to be in the most positive range, say in the 20 to 30. And what you want to avoid is the fact that you are 75% positive, but close to half of your samples are in the suspect or negative range. So basically what we're aiming for is for 75% of them to be positive, but also to have basically a flat distribution. Most of the chicks are in the same place. We have moved on to use the CT values to evaluate things such as dose, basically comparing full dose use versus half dose use. And then we have moved on to actually compare results among hatcheries for a particular company and look at their hatchery performance. We are using this technique to evaluate differences between different equipment, different vaccine volumes, 7, 14, 25, and actually evaluating gel versus spray delivery of vaccine. And last but not least, now we are moving on to use this technique to compare how the vaccines interact with each other after hatchery vaccination. So in this case, this is a graph showing the IBron in the vertical axis and mass in the horizontal axis. And basically what we want to see is that all the results fall in the green area, the high positive range. Here we have 83% of them falling into this green area. Basically the two vaccines are working together rather well. And we continue to do this with other vaccine combinations. As I mentioned, we also use the RT-PCR for diagnostics. And this is an example from a broiler complex in Texas from a sample in October of 2019. This complex was on a mass and con vaccination program at the hatchery, and they had a primary complaint of increased air sac condoms. And what I want you to see here is that we basically caught the DMV virus red-handed, right at the acute point of the infection. And in these graphs, basically, we have the CT values in inverse order because they have an inverse relationship to the amount of virus. So I want this graph to give you a visual of how much virus we're picking up in the samples. Here we have flux on 28 to 45 days, and I'm highlighting the results from the 29-day-old flux. 29-day-old flux, where basically we have found the virus in high levels in trachea, air sac, kidney, and the cecal tonsils. These are high-level amounts of virus. This is an acute infection with DMV1639. Also want you to notice the fact that we do have persistence of the Connecticut virus, which was part of the vaccination program. And again, this is testament to the sensitivity of the qRT-PCR. I mean, we normally thought these viruses would clear, but the fact is that the more and more surveillance we have done since 2015 is some vaccine viruses tend to persist, more or less at random times, and they will pop up, but it can happen. But again, this is a new DMV challenge area. Notice those low CT values. This is acute phase infection. And basically, the mass and con program was unable to protect against the DMV 1639 challenge. Here, I would like to share with you an example of surveillance. This is looking at two adjacent complexes, each one processing about 1.2 million birds per week. These two complexes are for the same company. They're in the same state. And we tested tracheas in flux 21 to 57 days old. Basically, in this first graph, this is when the complex was on Mass and Ark program, tracheas between January and March of 2019. And I want you to see the large amount of color here. What this means is that we were detecting their vaccination viruses in their vaccination program, but also we detected the Georgia 13 and DMV 1639. And so basically we had Georgia 13, DMV 1639, and rolling Ark, leading to increased condoms and the plan for AirSac. They moved on to a Mass and IBron program, and in this lower right graph, we're showing the birds on the Mass and IBron program between March of 2019 and March of 2020. And basically, this is 31 flocks in chronological order with improved bird health and performance and no detections of Georgia 13, DMV, or the rolling Ark. We basically are detecting Mass and IBron. So the Mass and IBron program delivered as promised. Another example here, just looking at broilers in Northeast Georgia, sample in March of 2020. This is a complex on a Mass and IBron program. And I want you to notice that even though they're in the Georgia 13, DMV 1639 area, and they were on IBron from Mass and IBron since 2017, we have not detected Georgia 13 or DMV 1639. And basically what we're seeing is a typical IBron clearance pattern. We have flux here looking at tracheas from 24 to 38 days old, the same flux, the cecal tonsils. And what you will see with IBron time and time again is that as the flux get older, it starts clearing the trachea and it sits higher in the cecal tonsil. All bronchitis viruses do. So basically, as the broilers age, IBron decreases in trachea, increases cecal tonsils, and it follows these clearance pattern time and time again. So it immunizes and it clears. And then when the rubber meets the road here is you want to know what does IBron do for these complexes with increased air sac at the processing plant. And here we have an example in the top right where condoms from total condoms went up primarily from air saculitis, and they had condoms as high as 10%. And here, this arrow, this is when the first IBron vaccinated flocks started to be processed, and basically their programs, the Mass IBron program, basically started a new normal for them with decreased condoms, and that carried over from 2016 into 2017, and it carried over through the winter, through the worst part of the challenge. And here in the lower right, we have a similar example, high condoms to basically to AirSac condoms. And when the first IBron birds are processed here, basically a new normal for condoms starts with this complex that carry over in the blue line into 2017. So what I wanted to convey to you today is that IBron is the go-to vaccine in the face of Georgia 08, Georgia 13, and DMV1639 challenge. IBron and Bron Mass extend cross-protection to Ark, and IBron and Bron Mass are supported by an innovative technical and scientific services. And I'll finish where I started. IBron and Bron Mass provide relevant cross-protection for our times. And with that, I thank you.